Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this session on getting started with IBM I Security. This is session 4 on user privileges, and we are excited to bring this content to you. We've been really excited about how many people have been signed up, so hopefully this has been useful educational material. Always happy to take suggestions for additional topics, so please feel free to communicate with us, but share this and hopefully enjoy everything that we're presenting to you here today. My name is Robin Tatum. I know many of you know me at this point because I've done these sessions for years, but I'm the Director of Security Technologies here at Help Systems. That's my direct contact information. If you do have a question and you're shy to ask, please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. Otherwise, use the chat window. We are recording the session, as I mentioned earlier, and we will provide you a link to that. My role here at Help Systems is really as the evangelist of security. I'm also one of the SMEs for Common, so I'll be heading down to St. Louis here in about a little over a month to attend Common, so hopefully I can see everybody down there. But my role is simply to help you with your security initiatives. That's part of a larger Help Systems security investment, both from a product perspective under the PowerTech brand, as well as the services offerings represented by Carol Woodbury and her security team. We're a part of PCI as well as NASBA, meaning we can educate auditors, and we're also the publisher of the annual State of IBM I Security report. And there are statistics within that report that talk about how people set up their user profiles, which is, of course, the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. So if you're not overly familiar with some of the common mistakes that people make, I would certainly recommend downloading and taking a gander at that report. The big thing for me with users is that we tend to provide them with access levels at least equal to, if not far beyond, their business requirements. So in essence, we have overcome at this point, or they have overcome, the primary hurdle that a hacker or somebody with malintention would attempt to gain, which is the ability to connect to your systems. When we give them these keys, which we often do within short order after they start, after being hired, we have to assume that they may not know what to do with those credentials or that they may want to do something that we would prefer they didn't. And we don't want to gamble on the fact that they're not even going to attempt to. And I still hear, even in this day and age, that the employees have no reason to do that or they don't know how to do that. And we just simply tend to trust them by default. You have to ask yourself, if there were paper files of all the payroll information, would you leave those out in the break room? And if the answer is no, why is it okay to trust people electronically when we wouldn't necessarily trust beyond what is reasonable in a more tangible world? At the end of the day, would you bet your entire career on that, on the fact that somebody wouldn't have some kind of hidden agenda or perhaps a personal circumstance that would lead them to want to do something that perhaps would not be deemed legal or even ethical? Now, of course, at the bottom of most hacks is the fact that the person connecting into the system is not actually the person that was given the credentials. So even though Bob in accounting may have a very pure heart and would be outraged at the idea that we'd ever do something illegal, what if somebody has Bob's credentials and Bob's credentials allow him to do anything that he wants? Now, he may not abuse that, but somebody else might. So we have to understand that credentials are important, but they shouldn't be limitless because it means somebody could easily then carry them forward beyond what their original intent was. Now, I mentioned the State of IBM I Security data in the report. This is culminated from years worth of research that we do. We run security scans on people's systems. I'm going to talk more about the security scan a little bit later, but there is an option within the security scan whether you're willing to share that data anonymously with us. And if you do, then what we do is aggregate and compile that into a study report. And there is a lot of room for improvement, not only in user profiles, but also system values and public authorities and in other areas of importance in IBM I Security. A couple of examples of things that relate to profiles is the fact that we have a lot of dormant profiles for most IBM I systems. This is really often based on the fact that users will be created. They will live on the system for a period of time. And at the point where they leave the organization or the profile is no longer required, we tend to just leave it there. And this is often because the profile now owns all kinds of objects, and it makes it very difficult to remove it because we have to figure out the transference of the ownership of those objects. The operating system actually has the ability to automatically disable an account that has been dormant for a given period of time. The Analyze Profile Activity command allows you to do that, and I would strongly recommend the use of that. Even if you choose not to delete the profile, you should at least disable it to ensure that it's not eligible for interactive sign-on. Now, I don't say it's not able to be used because a disabled account can still run a batch job. So just be aware that even if a profile has been disabled, the good news, bad news is there is not probably going to be too much to breaks, but it could also still provide risk if there is something that is submitted to batch under the auspices of that profile, that it may have the capability to do something more than intended. But I would offer up the idea of having 346 profiles on average that haven't been used in at least 30 days, and 160 of those on average being enabled is certainly way beyond what we would tolerate in any other IT environment. Now, these graphs look similar, but they are different. These are the number of profiles that are on the system and exist with a password that matches the name of the profile. Now, we all talk about the fact that users tend to write passwords down or stick it on a Post-it note somewhere, right? But the reality is that if we as administrators create these profiles with a password that simply mirrors the name of the profile, well, we're certainly making it an open door coming in. Now, I know many of you are sitting there but saying, hey, Robin, we set the password to expired so that we know the user has to change the password the first time they connect. And that is arguably the most common configuration setting. But you have to realize, what if that user never signs in? Or what if somebody else gets to that profile first? They'll get the opportunity to change that password initially. And at that point, maybe the damage has been done. I can't tell you how many times I've audited a system and found that there are default passwords for the accounts, even though the account owners have told me, yeah, we don't do that. So I definitely recommend running an Analyze Default Password command, even if you are confident in your procedures and the fact that you don't follow those practices, because I think you may be surprised. In fact, 88 enabled accounts on each system as an average exist with a default password, and that's the first thing most people are going to guess. It's really just a provisioning issue. It's not a technical issue. Make sure that you are setting the password initially to star none or to something that is known but not a mirror of the profile name. And then when the user is ready to sign on, you assign the first password, set it to expired, and then they can pick a secret one. If you are at version 7, release 2, or later, which hopefully you all are because 7.1 is on its way out, just know that there is a password policy attribute that will allow you to tell the system that you do not wish to have any default passwords on the system, and that is applicable even using the create and change user profile command, which means it also applies to the administrators. Now, when we talk about IBMI profiles, we have to understand that there are 3 primary entities. A traditional user profile, that's what most of us think of when we talk about user accounts. We also have a special thing called SST or DST users, and these are users of a low-level environment, kind of like the BIOS of your PC, if you're familiar with that. Lets us initialize disk units and run COM traces and other kinds of scary functions. That's an entirely different set of user IDs and passwords as of version 5 of the operating system. We also have validation list users. These are people that are added to a special object called a validation list, and that list can contain encrypted information. That means that as an application developer, I can write code that will check to see if a user is in the validation list and whether their password that has been supplied is correct. This is very useful when you have a web type application. Maybe you have a consumer type application and you have it running on IBMI. You don't want to have to create a native IBMI user ID to store their account information because they may never come back. So what we do is add them to a validation list, and it's just a kind of secondary ability for us to store and validate credentials. We're going to focus our attention predominantly on the user profile up at the top there, which is the traditional IBM I user ID, so that we can make sure that that's configured correctly. All right. Now, these user profiles are actually objects on the system. So you can do a work object and find all user profiles. And inside that user profile, there is a definition telling the system what type of capabilities that user will have, the environmental considerations such as their default out queue or their job description, as well as indicating resource or object permissions. The operating system comes with a number of these predefined. We are probably familiar with QSecOffer and QSysOffer, for example, but others will live on your system depending on the licensed program products that you have installed. So if you're using BRMS for backup recovery media services, then you will have a profile called QBRM and QBRMS. All right, so your list may differ from the person sitting next to you, and it's important to know which IBM profiles do exist on your system, because people have a tendency to look at it and say, hey, it's a profile that begins with the letter Q, which is the standard IBM naming convention. But that's not a reserved convention. IBM may not create other profile names, but what if you have a Quentin or a Quincy? If you eliminate all of the Q profiles from your audits, you will perhaps be overlooking somebody who is actually a true user on the system. So certainly be familiar with the IBM profiles. Also, my recommendation is not to modify them. So many people add additional privileges to the IBM profiles, giving them capabilities far in excess of what they need. IBM knows what that profile needs, and it gave them the special authorities necessary, as well as any other private authorities. So modifying that or tampering it could create issues, and if IBM changes that profile in the future, it may cause issues to your production applications. The biggest tip that I always give people is that the profile and password combination is often the biggest and certainly even the only hurdle that many of us put between the person sitting in the chair and that database information. So it's critical that we make that count, make it robust. We don't want to assume that somebody wouldn't have the intent to do something or that they wouldn't know how to do something. Like I said, any system that is ever breached, somebody has obtained credentials or been given those credentials at some point. Now, I think many of us have kind of looked at the IBM I system, previously known as iSeries or AS400, as being a secure platform and that it's hack-proof, right? We've heard that. The reality is that a lot of that is based on the idea that people don't know this platform as well as they know Windows. And so the vulnerabilities that are found within the Power environment perhaps are not the same, and therefore we don't see as many headlines that pertain to our platform. But that does not mean that we are completely hidden and fly below the radar. This is a book. I actually own a copy. I'm not a huge fan of the content, so I'm not recommending you buy it, but just know that it is out there in the marketplace, and it spells out really not hacking of the iSeries or later, but more exploiting. So it talks about the common vulnerability errors and tells people how to exploit them, and then gives just a very brief synopsis of how to resolve it. So most of what you will read in there is resolvable. You just have to understand that the default configuration does open up your system potentially to the ability to connect without necessarily the constraints that you may believe are in place. When it comes to sharing, we always like to encourage our kids to play nice and to let them use things. But the reality is that in many other areas, sharing is problematic. We don't always encourage people to share, although that is certainly nice with ice cream. We don't want them doing it with their user profiles. Most regulations will speak to the fact specifically that users should not share user accounts because at the end of the day, they have no accountability then. When two people are signed on as the same account concurrently and something goes wrong, how do I know which of those people caused the issue? The operating system has a number of system values to control the password policy. There was one added in version 6 release 1 called QPassword rules. About 25–30% of you are using that at this point, so it's not overly adopted. But that QPassword rules facility is more like a repository that lets you specify all of your password rules in one place. And you can pull up all these system values, including QPassword rules, using that worksysval command so that you can define what the user's password policy is going to be. First thing I tell people is before you start creating user profiles or when you inherit this, make sure you've got a policy that identifies what that profile is for and what capabilities it should carry. If you're just copying another profile and letting it go on its way, you really don't have any clear definition, and it makes it very difficult to maintain consistency. Now, this policy should identify what type of access control rules should be in place, what applications should the user have access to, what databases, as well as the role of that user. Now, my preference is rather than copying another individual user's profile, which I know we all do, but rather create some templates based on the roles that exist. Help Systems has a great user provisioning facility that is role-based, so certainly we can help you with that if you have a large number of users or you're struggling with creating users across multiple partitions. It's called Power Admin, and I'd be happy to give you information on that. But even on a single system, single partition, creating a template profile and using that as the basis for any new creation is very beneficial. Once you know what role the user is in, checking that profile on occasion, which you should be doing, folks, and checking to ensure that it has consistent configuration is very, very important, just in case somebody threw all object onto the profile to fix a problem and then forgot to take it off. Now, the people that create profiles are often administrators, of course, but we also find people like help desk workers who are there in order to assist with resetting passwords or re-enabling accounts, and they're often turned into security administrators in order to work with the profiles. But my preference would be for them to use a programmatic approach for that task or for those two tasks. That way, they can perform a basic reset, but they don't have to have the full-blown capabilities of a security administrator who can work with all of the profile attributes, not just the status and password field. If you are auditing on your system, which we recommend and we've talked about in prior sessions, then you will record the change or creation of a user profile. That's logged under the STAR security events, but I want you to note that deletion of a profile is not logged as a security event, and that's because it's seen as a deletion event. It really could fall under either, but IBM looked at it and said, well, the profile's not being leveraged in any way, so it's closer to a deletion than a security event, therefore we'll just log it that way. In order to set up a profile, I mentioned you have to be a security administrator, and that's a special authority on that person's profile. Fortunately, the operating system prevents anybody from giving privileges to somebody that you yourself don't have. So if I'm a security administrator, but I don't have, say, SafeSys authority, I don't have permission to give anybody else SafeSys. Now, that's a good thing because if we don't trust you to have SafeSys, why would we want you to give it to somebody else? But unfortunately, it also means that for many of us, when we make somebody a security administrator, we also just simply make them a security officer, which grants them all 8 special authorities, not just the administration rights. Now, it's worth noting that if you have all object special authority, you can run a job as somebody else and do so quite legitimately. And that enables you to work around the restriction that prevents you from giving authorities to somebody else. In fact, you can give them to yourself at that point. So be cognizant if you have users, or for example, the 200 average users that have all object, then you should be very aware that a user potentially can gain all of the other special authorities. The command most of us use to create a new profile is create user profile. Some people use Navigator for I. In fact, feel free to use the chat window. Let me know which you use. But at the really onset of the creation of the profile, it doesn't matter which approach you need or which one you use. They both do the same thing, which is to create the profile behind the scenes, the profile object. Now, there's a number of parameters on that particular command. We'll start with the user profile. This is the name of the user. And most of us use a naming convention that entails the first letter of the first name followed by the last name, or the first name followed by the first initial of the last name. So it's a very easily guessed naming convention. Certainly if I know that that's what my profile is, there's a very good chance that I can figure out what everybody else's profile name is. And bear in mind that most people, for their IBM I profile, the user ID is half of the equation. Certainly it's the easier half, but by being able to guess the user ID, you've basically given them part of the puzzle. Some experts recommend that you create a naming convention that is easy to remember for the employee, but not necessarily easily guessed or quite so easily guessed. Department, location, or a name combination. Now, of course, that adds some complexity if the user changes department or location, but if they have an employee number or something that perhaps isn't sitting as a nameplate on their desk, that would make it a little bit easier for somebody to remember, but harder for somebody else to guess. Now, the password attribute is arguably the most important parameter on the create user profile and change user profile command. My suggestion is to never retain the default star user profile, even if you are anticipating the user signing on soon thereafter to change it. That's because they may get distracted or go home sick or quit and never actually sign on. And if you're not aware of that fact, then that profile can sit out there indefinitely. I typically suggest that we use a password of *none for group profiles, for profiles that are designed simply to create objects, or any profile that you wish to prevent from signing on to an interactive display. Use the controls that you've been given to enforce the password policy. I mentioned those QPWD system values. That's what they're there for. Make sure they are optimally configured and fully used. IBM changed from using default passwords on their own profiles, so if you are worried about IBM profiles, just know none of the IBM profiles, with the exception of QSEC Offer, has to have a password. All right, so you can set it to password *none, and there will be no issue. Be aware, however, if you've changed it or you originated from an older system and you save and restore, you may still want to check and see if there is an IBM profile as part of the list of default passwords. Just know that if you find one, you can change it to *none, which doesn't mean it doesn't need a password. It means you can't sign on. You can do so without creating any issue whatsoever. To determine whether any of these profiles have it, again, use the Analyze Default Password command. You should run this frequently and review the list, and there should be nobody in it. If you have service accounts and things like that, then that becomes a little bit of an extra challenge. My suggestion there is to layer compensating controls in place. For example, if the profile is there for an application connection, for example, make sure it is set to initial menu *sign-off, initial program *none. That will make sure if somebody does sign on, they get bounced back off. But don't overlook, what if they connect to an interface that doesn't have a menu or a program, such as FTP or ODBC? You need to have exit programs in order to prevent that default password profile from being able to connect through them. Doesn't stop everything, but it certainly helps eliminate the majority of the risk. We talked about exit programs in a prior session, so if you were not able to listen into that, check out the recordings and you'll have access to it. Prior to IBM I version 7.2, administrators could create any password. Didn't have to conform to the rules. So you could have a minimum length of 128, and an administrator was still allowed to create a password of A. Starting in 6.1, we start logging if the passwords don't meet the policy. So an administrator would at least have a log if they were creating passwords that were insufficient. Starting in 7.2, you can enforce that now by specifying the value *AllCreateChange in the QPassword rules facility in conjunction with the definition that we don't want default passwords. All right. Now, users aren't allowed to select default passwords, so we don't have to worry about them creating an issue. We can't blame them. We have to look to the administrators, which is good news because then it simply means for most of us just a tweak in our onboarding provisioning processes mean this problem is actually eliminated. Setting the password to expired is how we commonly force the user to change the password, but we don't want to rely on that because there's no guarantees who the person is who's actually using it. And if you set your passwords to *none, like I've suggested in some ways or sometimes, you can't set the password also to expired. So that's why I had an intermediate step there that initially set the password to star none. When the user is ready to sign on, set the password to something that you can share with them, set it to expired, and that way you know they're about ready to sign in, and we'll change it when they get there. Speaking of expiring the password, there is an option to set an interval so that the system will automatically expire the password after a certain period of time. Now, in the profile, this is an override to the system value of a very similar name. My suggestion is never set it to star nomax, certainly never set it to nomax in the system value, but try not to set it even that way in the user profile unless it's an application profile and there's really just no choice. You don't want the application to have to be modified to be able to connect. There is no reason, in my opinion, that an end user would ever have a nomax option specified simply because they don't want to change their password. Now, the password change block is a restriction that was added in version 6.1 that allows you to specify the number of hours that must pass before a user can change their password again. So if they're forced to do a password change, they can't turn around and automatically do another one immediately following. And this is, again, an override to a system value of a similar name and is designed really to prevent somebody from banging out multiple password changes in a row simply to get back to their original favorite password that you just forced them to change. We all hate passwords. I get it. You know, we're doing a lot more now with multi-factor authentication. Some people are using single sign-on, but we certainly want to ensure that a user can't circumvent the controls if we have indeed implemented a restriction. The display sign-on information parameter is a little bit outdated now. It displays a sign-on or a post sign-on screen that tells the user the last date and time that they signed on. The problem with it is two things. One is that users typically see it simply as a nag screen. They know that once they sign on, that's what's going to pop up. They don't know why they're seeing it, and so they just get used to typing their credentials and hitting enter twice. The other reason is because with the advent of PCs, what happens is when the user connects to what we used to call the router, but when the user connects to the system, that is the date, potentially, of the last connection. So when you see that sign-on screen telling you the date and time that you last connected, it may be just 2 seconds earlier, right? It's important to know, and as an administrator, I sometimes run that, but if I'm on vacation and I come back and it tells me useful information to say I was signed on yesterday, then that's beneficial. But for most of us using PCs, of course, this doesn't provide very useful information. So I'm not a big proponent on this. The limit device session has been around forever. It was a restriction of 5.4 and earlier that was very inflexible. You could specify, in essence, how many concurrent sessions that profile can be signed on to. It's a way of limiting the sharing of profiles, or at least concurrent sharing of profiles. It used to be an on-off. You could either have one session or you could have an unlimited number of concurrent sessions. But this option was updated because this is a common thing within regulatory mandates. It was updated in 6.1 to make it a little bit more friendly. It allows you to designate now a number between 0 and 9 in addition to the original all or nothing to say how many times this profile can be signed on concurrently because, let's face it, I know I have multiple sessions running and you probably do as well. Just adhere to any compliance regulations that may tell you that's not allowed. Otherwise, you may find yourself in hot water if you get audited. This, again, is an override to a system value. So what you're seeing here is a significant trend that a lot of the profile parameters are deferring their decision to a central attribute, which is part of your system values. The status parameter indicates whether you want this profile to be enabled or disabled, and I've put an underlined note there that it's for sign-on. Again, as a reminder, you can still submit a job as a disabled account. So if that profile is in the job schedule entry, for example, as the host of a job, whether that's a good thing or a malicious thing is unknown, of course, but it can still run that job. So disabling a profile doesn't prevent it from doing everything. It just prevents the actual human from signing on to an interactive display. All right. Now, the status can be manually manipulated using the create and change user profile, but most typically it is set in conjunction with the two system values that control how many attempts the user is given to sign onto the system. QMAX sign, and then its sister, the QMAX sign action, indicates how many tries are allowed, where incorrect credentials are provided, and what action should be taken afterwards. My recommendation is to disable any profile that has a password of *none, assuming that that profile is not used for sign-on. Now, I don't recommend disabling IBM profiles, so just let me reiterate. Do not change the status of any profile supplied by IBM, which typically starts with the letter Q, but be careful, because if you disable a profile, you can potentially have issues because QUser, for example, causes all kinds of issues if it becomes disabled. All right, but for your own profiles, that is okay. Now, if the QSEC offer profile becomes disabled because of too many invalid sign-ons, just know that it's not permanently disabled from all access attempts. You can still sign on to the console and re-enable them. Now, that assumes you know the password. If you don't know the password and you've disabled it, you either have to use a different SecOffer account or to re-enable it. Otherwise, you have to IPL your system and go through DST, et cetera, or hard into DST from the front panel. User class, very important from a security perspective. This is kind of an overall suggestion on the role of this user. There are 5 templates provided by IBM, ranging from security officer all the way down to end user. Now, I say it's important, but it's predominantly most important when the profile is first created, because that's really the only time it has major influence. Now, the user class itself doesn't mean a whole lot. It's more about the special authorities that are granted that gets carried with that, okay? So as a security officer, what makes me a security officer? Well, the fact that that template automatically gives me, by default, all 8 special authorities, and a user gets none, all right? That does not mean that I can't manually manipulate that list. I can take all the special authorities away from a SecOffer, and they're operating more like a user, and probably more importantly, in vice versa. And often we see programmers and users as the class, but they've been given all object or other things. Now, these are the special authorities that are granted at level 30 security and higher, but you absolutely need to be at 40 or higher. So hopefully if you're at 10 or 20 or even 30, we need to talk, all right? So once the profile is created, and if you see the message that the user class and special authorities don't match, the reason is you've manipulated the list so that it doesn't quite match the original template. There's nothing wrong with that. Just know that if you are auditing your profiles, don't put as much emphasis on the user class as you do on the special authorities. The other thing that the user class may influence is which options appear on IBM supplied menus. So if you are a programmer, for example, and you do a go space main command, you'll go to the IBM main menu, and there is an option 5 for Program Development Manager. That's only visible if you have a programmer class or higher, all right? So it does influence IBM supplied menus, but that's really about it. It is by far most influential on the special authorities that are granted. All right, let's talk about special authorities, because that's, like I said, probably with password, the most important parameter on the profile. Defining your users within a kind of role-based model is beneficial here, because that helps with which special authorities perhaps they are given. Far too often, I audit a system and I find profiles that have privileges, and I ask, why do they have that? And the answer is invariably, we don't know, or we're afraid to remove it because we don't want to break the application, or they've always had that and we copied them from somebody else or another system, and there's really just a major disconnect on why these users have these privileges. Part of that comes back to the fact that most people don't know what the privileges enable the user to do. So who cares if they have job control? They need to run jobs, right? Well, they can do a lot more than that. So the bottom line is, don't give a user special authorities. They're special for a reason, folks, unless there really is a proven requirement. If the user belongs to a group profile, they will inherit any special authorities also from any and all groups. So that is definitely important. If you are using groups, make sure that you are aware of that. If you audit your individual users, it may not be evident that they're actually operating with a privilege like all object because it doesn't display it immediately in view. Okay, so make sure you accommodate that inheritance feature when you are designing and auditing your profile environment. Rather than give an authority to an end user for a particular task, I am a fan of setting things up programmatically. You can use techniques called adoption or swapping that allows the program to perform a task, and then you simply enable the user to call that program. It means that if they have job control, for example, they can potentially run a particular command, but they don't do everything or don't have the ability to do anything else related to that particular authority. All right, so let's talk about the 8. The most important one by far is all object special authority. If you're familiar with Unix, this is root privileges, which in essence says do whatever you want. So think of it as the gold key to every object that resides on the system, not only those that you create, but everybody else as well, including your application providers and even IBM. So this is the ability for a user to, in essence, delete the entire system. And there's lots of damage that can be done with just a single command. It also allows a user potentially to gain the other 7 special authorities that we're going to talk about next. So all object really is the keys to the kingdom. You don't want people having this simply because they need to access a particular file. Even, or especially, programmers don't need this authority on a production system. You can still give someone all privileges to a group of objects, maybe the entire application. But if you give them all object special authority, you can't stop them very easily, and they not only have all access to that application, but every other application, including the one that runs your server. Security administrative privileges allow a user to create a new user account. We talked about that a little bit. Bear in mind that if you do a work user profile star all and you don't see what appears to be the full list, what that means is you have security administrative privileges, but you don't have at least use rights to the other profiles. And this is confusing for people sometimes. That's why they end up suddenly turning that administrator into a security officer, because that fixes the problem. Well, the actual problem is that the user doesn't have use rights to that other set of profiles, maybe because they don't have all object, which I don't typically recommend anyway, or they were not the user that created the other profile, and therefore they don't own it and they don't have rights to it, so they don't see it. My suggestion is when you create a user profile, change the ownership to a standard owner that is part of the administrative group potentially, and you can then see it from there. All right. Now, being the member of a group gives you special privileges, so we may want to talk about that a little bit, but making somebody a security officer is pretty significant. SecAdmin really should be most of what you need. IOSysconfig is input-output system configuration, meaning that you can configure lines, controllers, and devices. If you're younger than me and you don't know what a line controller and device is, then just think of the TCP configuration. It's in essence the communications in and out of the machine. Any of those things can be started and stopped and reconfigured, and of course the fact that people are communicating with the server over these channels means that if you misconfigure them, that can create all kinds of issues. If you're also securing your system based on not starting everything, like FTP, just know that if you have IOSysconfig, you can change it to be started, and you can set it to auto-start the next time the system IPLs. So lots of things you can do here that really are not things that the average user should be able to do. Audit privileges allow a user to turn on and off the audit facilities included in IBMI, as well as indicate what type of event should be logged. Again, we talked about that in a prior session, so if you're interested in auditing, check that out. IBM separates this for separation of duty. If you have a regulatory mandate, such as Sarbanes-Oxley, that is very hot on the idea of the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing, if we made the security officer also the audit officer, then they could turn the auditing off, do their task, and then turn it back on. So what I suggest is, in a perfect world, we have a separation of the roles. But I also am realistic and have been on the platform long enough to know that we don't have an overabundance of administrators and auditors and security officers managing our systems. So for most of us in the IBMI community, this is a shared role, but the operating system does support it if your regulation demands it or your internal policies demand it. All right. Spool control is the all object of spool files, meaning you can see any spool file in any output queue, no restriction. This is important because for many of us, we control access to the database. Even if you could see the data within the database, often it is going to look somewhat unreadable. Not that it's necessarily encrypted, although hopefully it is if it's sensitive data, but let's assume you just see the raw data. I got to know where one field ends and another begins. It's not evident, especially if I download that data and it's just in its raw form. However, just imagine we run a process over the payroll data and we print payroll checks. It's all nicely formatted. It has column headers. It has all of our deductions and our take-home. And then we let people see it there. So we protect the database, but don't protect the printed output, and it's equally important. Service privileges allow us to access that area of the system that I mentioned called SST. So remember there was a different kind of users. Having service lets me get to the login screen for that, but then I have to have the alternate credentials. So my interpretation really is that service is not as powerful as it once was, but that is built on the expectation that you have changed the very well-known and well-documented default passwords within SST. So the 11111111 profile with a matching password, the 22222 profile with a matching password, make sure they don't exist, all right? And you can check to see if passwords have been changed within SST. Job control is a very powerful privilege and also the most popular privilege to be given. It is not an authority that allows you to simply run jobs. You don't need an authority for that. Every user can do it. Job control is the administrative privilege that allows me to start and stop other people's jobs and stop subsystems. It also allows me potentially to bring the system down into a restricted state. It also potentially allows me to access spool files if the out queue is deemed as operator control. Now, I may not be able to see the spool file, but I can put it on hold and move it and things like that. Service actually should say save restore. That caught me off guard a little bit there, so I'll make sure we correct that before we distribute it, but it should be save restore. And save restore is going to allow the user to back up and restore any object on the server. Now, the reason I have the underlined note there is because if you are securing your system at only the library level, you can back an object up out of that secured library and restore it to a non-secured library, and now I can access a copy. And maybe I can download it. Maybe I can even change that duplicate version, back it up again, and restore it over the top of the original. So we got to be careful there. The other thing that we have to be cognizant of is that on all the save commands, there is a parameter called storage free. And if you specify that value, then when the save completes, the storage basically taken up by the object is freed up, and it does that by deleting the data. So in essence, save restore rights are going to give me potentially change rights and delete rights to files that I would not normally be authorized to. So again, I apologize, it should say star save restore there. As a general rule, we have this being assigned to far too many people. This is an extract from the State of Security study. I have a recommendation of somewhere around the 10 mark, that's this blue line here that you see, as being certainly justifiable. You may have some more that you know about that you say, hey, Robin, I've got 12. What's wrong with that? Well, nothing, as long as it was assigned on purpose. But look at this, 200 users on average with all object, almost 350 with job control. So lots of things that can be done here far in excess of what needs to be done. If you have almost 350 server administrators in an IBM I world, let me know. I want to come work for you because that's a heck of investment in the platform. The limit capabilities parameter is another one important. Many of us use this, but not in the correct